Evening, and welcome to the 10th and final installment of our NavRatri commentary series, dedicated towards explicating the 9 nights of Goddess Durga. Now this piece is somewhat different than those, insofar as it is not about one of the 9 nights, but rather the 10th day which comes after them. This is variously known as Vijayadashami or Dussehra, victory on the 10th, the destruction of evil. In many places, the day is held to commemorate the victory of Lord Rama over the demon emperor Ravana, where it is more prominently known as Dussehra. In others, it celebrates the victory of Durga over Mahishasura, and is hailed as Vijayadashami. Others still connect it to the events of the Kurukshetra war of the Mahabharata. The common unifying factor in all of these is, as can be clearly adduced via the name of the occasion, a militant, martially, but also importantly, piously attained triumph over the malefic, the Arti-cle, the Anarian, or if you prefer, the demonic. Now personally, I tend to fall into the middle camp with my observances, regarding it as a Durgan occasion, both due to personal theology and resonance, as well as because it makes the most sense, to me anyway, to have this as the effective post-culmination of the 9 nights. Yet with this year's occasion falling upon a Monday, Moon's Day, it is sensible to also have regard for the Rama-relating remembrances as well. But those shall not form the focal scope of this piece, which instead seeks to continue the progression of the mythic cycle of Durga, as set out through the previous 9 nights' worth of commentary, and use this as a springboard to talk about the other common feature of Vijayadashami or Dussehra observances, Astra Puja. I have spoken at some length about both the generalized conceptions of Dharma Yuddha as well as the more specific struggle against the demon Mahishasura elsewhere and earlier in the series, in particular in the Katyayani piece, as well as the Mahalaya Amavasya piece with which we closed Pitru Paksha, the fortnight of the ancestors, to name but 2 of especial interest. So I shall not seek to repeat much of that material here, except to briefly remind readers who may not be so directly familiar with the relevant mythology that Mahishasura was such a dangerous foe, due to a boon he had been granted, which rendered him invulnerable to all but a woman, a weakness which he had deliberately chosen, as there had to be some condition to his invincibility due to the effective nature of Hindu divine legalism in this area. He chose this as he had not believed it possible for a female to form much of a martial threat against him, which therefore led to an escalatingly dire situation for the male members of the pantheon when they attempted to defend against him, until such point as they invoked the great goddess, a most powerful emanation of which, Goddess Durga, took to the field against the demon army, outfitted with the panoply of war, derived from the customary armaments and iconographic associations of the various predominantly male devas who had beseeched her for aid, the results of which I have again detailed much more expressively elsewhere, but suffice to say, these put Mahishasura in a situation wherein his saliency upon the battlefield was basically equivalent to throwing Molotovs against Poseidon, if doing that made Poseidon really angry, to the point that Poseidon doesn't just decapitate the foe, but proceeds to tap dance vigorously upon the severed head thereof, while also continuing to eviscerate the attempting to flee spirit of the then pendingly deceased. You get the idea. The core of this element is what's being depicted in the fine wall sculpture with which the textual version of this piece was accompanied, with the beautifully enraged Devi Durga accompanied by Dawan, a bravery, her lion Vahana, the mount, lunging at the part buffalo demonic figure of Mahishasura, likely depicted after he'd, not to figuratively speak, literally lost his head. The first one anyway, with the actual buffalo shaping to it, immediately prior to his extermination via finding himself, not via self-realization, but implicit self-destruction, through serious arrogance and stupidity. He found himself at the figuratively wrong end of the Trishula. The figures around the combat are her 2 sons, Ganesha and Lord Skanda. The martial saliency of Ganesha is often understated. The Gana Isha, the Lord of the Host epithet is there for a reason, as it is the sobriquet around the remover of obstacles, via pulverizing and obliterating force where necessary. Lord Skanda, meanwhile, has a name that rather directly translates as assault, and would perhaps be thought of as our equivalent to Ares. The two other members of the Tridevi, Lakshmi and Saraswati, Parvati and Durga being the third, as you may have surmised, and looking out on from on high, presumably with praise and admiration, we find Lord Shiva, moon-crowned, Chandrasekhara. Partially these are standard iconographic accompaniments, especially in the Durga pandalas prominent in Bengal around this time. It is the combination of two of the Ordos, to which Durga is a vital component, the divine family of Shiva and Parvati, and the Tridevi, that are the great goddess, or great goddesses three. Yet it also helps to recall the concept, as covered in far more depth within the Sarva Pitru Amavasya and Devi Mahalaya piece, with which we presaged NavRatri this year, that both the manifestation of Durga and the victory thusly obtained by the side of righteousness against the Asura, the Arya, was very much a team effort, so to speak. And as we shall consider that concept, and how it pertains to exactly why it is that we observe Vijayadashami, or Dussehra, in just a moment. Yet before we do, a brief word on two of the more relevantly recent symbolic and figurative interpretations of the occasion, derived in no small part in relation to those aforementioned Anarian foes. The first of these has to be one of the more bizarre spectacles of recent years, and consists of the attempted moves by some minority groups within India to protest against, even to outright block and seek to oppose through legal challenges, the celebration of Durga's victory over Mahishasura. The reason that they do this is because they have taken to considering Mahishasura something of a kinsman to them, potentially even an ancestor, and therefore hold that the occasion is, in effect, the glorification of an unmitigated massacre of their forebears by an invading Indo-European war goddess, and of course the Indo-Europeans. To which I can only retort that while the Narasimhan et al. DNA study on the genomic foundation of South and Central Asia has yet to conclusively identify a demon haplogroup running around out there in the wild, even if there were somehow a shred of truth to these claims, the scriptural materials are quite clear as to just who it is who is seeking to make war upon the heavens, and the indecent propositions resultant therefrom towards the goddess. And B, a moment's consideration will reveal that the appropriate action to undertake when you find yourself having descended from the monstrosity literally opposing the goddess at the heart of the universe herself is a forswearing of his legacy, a running away from it as fast as possible, and an attempt to live piously and against the grain of his example, not seeking to relitigate a decisively settled battlefield outcome from an existential war of who knows how long ago through a series of scattered and basically unsuccessful court actions. But then I'm biased, aren't I? As, in fact, is the universe herself. Anyway, the other, somewhat more recent set of developments around the deific and mytho-religious concept in question concerns the rather more immediate threats posed by historic Islamic invasion and subsequent British imperial dominion, the latter of which, as we explored in the Bharat Mata and the Indo-European deific of national identity, played its part in a bit of modernization of Devi to more directly link to the emergent Indian national identity and nationalist cause of the time. Hence Bharat Mata, Mother India, which, to be clear, was an evolution very much building upon enduring foundations that were already there, and which had already been developed in these directions multiple times as needed over the preceding millennia, and across the Indo-European sphere elsewhere in other contexts. While the former saw the Muslims correlated with Mahishasura for reasons which ought to be obvious. In both cases, the message was elegant in its complex simplicity. The nation, as with the victory, as with the goddess, is the result of many working together and pooling together, just as the gods did when invoking Devi to send and become Durga in their midst. The external threat, the external foe, which could not easily be countered, especially in terms of its cultural impacts and attempted erasure, nor meaningfully subdued through the grand force of the conventional arms of individual soldiers alone, although Shivaji of the Marathas certainly bucked the trend somewhat in this one, equipped, it must be noted, with the famed Bhavani Tulwar, the sword of the goddess herself, given unto him in a manner similar to Excalibur to King Arthur, as a sure sign of her divine favour and his destined re-establishment of Hindu Rashtra nation by fighting back against the Mughals at Co. What is shown there is that it could be beaten via enduring piety, via national consciousness as a political force, and both this and heritage as a collective memory, and via the divine blessing, as seen and secured through the on-rolling, unfurling folds of time. As a certain Spanish ruler is once said to have remarked, time and I against any other two. Not for nothing either is Kali. Time, amongst other translations such as death, the black or blackness, and iron, etc., in Hindu terms reckoned to be the most fearsome and formidable of foes for the would-be doer of malefic ills. So how does this relate to the custom of Astra Puja then, which also occurs upon this day? Well, at its most obvious, the honouring of weapons, and to be sure other implements of one's societal rule and function too, is the exaltation of the implements, the instruments, through which this victory is attained, and it is an appropriately broad assortment for an appropriately broad success. Hence why a journalist may honour his pen, his keyboard for instance, or an artist his brushes and easel. And note especially, well, for that matter, that Devi also wields amidst her panoply a flame with an animal head therein, to represent piety, faith, sacrifice, offering and oblation and nourishment, because these are the tools via which the community is protected, exalted and served. And of course, not forgetting the actual and rather literal weapons also richly blessed upon this day. Or for that matter, that speech, and all that is entailed and comes from it, learning, communication, thinking, knowledge, conceptry, understanding, the shouting roar of divine fury, is the grandest, most mighty weapon of all. And yes, we do have the relevant theology to support the statement, including one of my more fondly recalled instances of the Rig Veda, wherein Brihaspati conjures an orbital bombardment of a demon dragon via the recitation of a portion of the prayer in the divine speech which summons a meteor impact. But again I digress, somewhat anyway. The point is, we exalt this great weapon via engagement with the heritage, which is transmitted thence through, and the utilization, the learning, the uptake, the repetition, and the re-radiance back out again of its forms, role, and function. And this especially, that notion of re-radiance, but also of speech, Vach, brings us back right to Devi, to Durga, to Parvati, to Shakti. The course of the Navadurga processional, up through the 9 nights which have preceded this day, is one of ascension. It brings with Devi as Shailaputri, newly re-emergent into the world after sacrifice and suffering, then hearkens back up to the point at which she is once again the glorious world pillar. The absolute, the supreme, the post-ultimate phase is not simply a redescent via emanation, wherein Devi steps back down from her cosmic lion throne again, but rather a tacit and tangible rendering radiating back out of her blessings thence from, across and into the universal world, which, if you recall, is very much the idea contained within the last lines of the justly famed Devi Shukta of the Rig Veda, RV 1025, lines 7 to 8 in particular. To be found also within the same hymnal, of course, are the clear points around both the strong support and empowerment of Rudra, especially through his weapon, to make holy war against the enemy of piety, and Devi's own declarations of her involvement in just such a conflict, both personally and in terms of rallying and ordering her chosen people in amidst and to the cause. Rig Veda 10:125, line 6. In Suzerenti, that is, quite literally all-pervading, from the summit of the world, down through the worlds, and thence back up again, once more to heaven's highest height. So on one level, the conflicts around Astra Puja could be seen as a phenomenon of that wonderful Eliadean concept, the eternal return. And they would of course be both right and right, R-I-T-E. Beyond that particular Vedic verse, which, it must be remembered, also has a rather specific application, as explored in some of the previous commentaries in the series, there are any number of other instances of Astra-related rituals to be found within the Hindu scripture and broader mythology. After all, including, most prominently, the empowerment of various arrows and other such weapons to form, as I have occasionally only somewhat jokingly termed them, ancient Aryan nuclear weapons. As well as, for that matter, the processes via which an aspirant becomes an acknowledged master with his chosen craft of death, and is therefore given a suitably mighty weapon of lore and legend as a result, a symbolic attainment of his greatness as secured through his instrument of will, and to be his instrument of the inscribing of that will across the cosmos in blood and death, cracked among armour and shards of bone. And in a related sense, once we properly and truly perceive the chosen champions of the goddess as also being her weapons, then the notion that we support and empower them in a manner perhaps somewhat symbolically resonant of how the gods themselves once did likewise for her in their hour of need, this attains additional significance within the spanning sphere of referential perception. As we know from our prior studies in the fields of myth and metaphysics and metaphysical narrativistics, quite specifically, the greater the resonancy with the greater the concept, the greater the consequent contingency, and consecrated the results. But in the main, I think, and we shall rather rapidly draw things to a close here, so that I might perhaps, just perhaps, get some sleep before Amanda and myself later today, the co-occurrence of Astra Puja and the veneration of Mahishasura Mardini, the destroyer of the buffalo-headed demon, a theonym of the goddess which is directly that of her role and victory against the aforementioned adversary, Mahishasura. The reason why these are co-occurrent is because they are the same phenomenon. That is to say, Durga as Mahishasura Mardini, in particular, is the weapon of the gods, the ultima ratio retaim, so to speak, against whom none can stand. She is called into being for a particular purpose, and is wielded, if you like, on one level by the combined pantheon at large, who have invoked her, on the greater, truer level by herself, especially as Devi Shakti. And in this age of smart bombs and dumb politicians, the weapon which knows itself and is in complete self-control is the most formidable prospect indeed. The prospect of worship via which she was called out to, the missile-armed, missile as in Astra, which I have quite enjoyed as a word due to its multi-linguistic pun potential, for instance, star in Latin, although I have also had some resonant success with other forms of Astra and Shastra, that is to say, weapon and instrument and treatise or field of learning respectively, except that Shastra itself also means invocation, recitation, as of prayer, thus demonstrating just how coterminous the terms actually are, especially in practice, actuality, and actualization. In multiple senses of the term, some of them are rather modern. Well, it is exactly that. Astra Puja, Devi Puja, the continuation of astral warfare by any other means. All things considered, it puts one in the mind of the words of Leonard Cohen. I'm guided by a signal in the heavens. I'm guided by this birthmark on my skin. I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons. And of course, to situate things further within the context of Devi, the meaning entailed in the name and form of the Sudarshana Chakra itself, referring to a beatific vision, theophany perhaps, darshana, that is radiant, and in a weaponized context, radiant in its destruction. With a longer A sound upon the end of one of the terms in question, this refers specifically to a beautiful woman, other than an application to Devi, who is indescribably so. I shall not venture to speculate how that may have eventuated. Meanwhile, the chakra itself, on one level, would refer to a destructive discus-like weapon, often associated with Vishnu. On another level, however, it is the wheel of time, a truly fearsome weapon indeed, and potentially also to the circle the cycle of the universe at large, which is appropriate considering the Vedic era symbolism of the worlds as akin to a chariot wheel radiating out from the central axis mundi, and which therefore underpins part of the universal sovereignty concept inherent in Chakravartin as well. She who ordains the motion of the wheel that is the world about her at its single point, guided by the beauty of our weapons indeed. But my point is, again, quite a simple one. Just as Durga Parvati, through the processional of the preceding 9 nights, had attained once more the world axis, the plenipotentiary situation upon it, and indeed as the summit of the universe entire, so too does this awesome power thence entail action, an active stewardship and custodian charge, Shakti again in a different sense of power. Also that Vajra as lightning bolt we can see picked out in gold in the illustrative image, which can correlate, interestingly enough, with Vakshansura in Vedic contexts as well. Just as the Trishula itself is also the world axis, and therefore her. Also, you see, she is the divine, the ultimate weapon, all the way both down and up still further. Irradiating out across the worlds from that summit, whether as light, whether as empowerments or impartments, e.g. cities, whether as indirect efforts through subtle or delicate manipulations, whether as direct issuing of orders, edicts, and directions, or indeed whether as all that is entailed in the strong breath, like the somewhat Akashic Vata, wind and tempest, Rig Veda 10, 125, line 8, with accompanying flight of arrows, birds, or thunderbolts, and the consequent weaponization of that radiance as a wave form of devastation, whose ultimate motion is that of one unstoppable spinning dance. On this day, as we have had ever in our minds for the preceding 9 nights, we carry out the ultimate Astra Puja, the request to serve the gods as Astra, and the honouring of the gods for their mighty role supporting the ultimate Astra herself, just as we support them in turn. We remember the heroic actions of God and man, a consistent theme with the Sarva Pitru, Amavasya and Devi Mahalaya, which immediately presage the 9 nights also. We recollect the sparks of inspiration from heritage and from history to be found even amidst the brighter lustre of day. We retrench ourselves in preparation for the next phase of the oncoming Dharma Yuddha. And above all, we remember and thence re-emanetize why they need it and why it needs us. Jai Mata Di. Jaya Jaya Hi Mahishasura Mardini Ramyaka Pardini Shaila Shute. We are the male about her fist.